Welcome to this FAR video. My name's Kieran Doe. I'm a senior tutor at ACA Masters. When I sat the ACA exams myself, I won ICAEW prizes for financial accounting and reporting, tax, audit, financial management, business strategy, and case study, including the highest score in the world. I now teach the exam techniques and learning strategies behind this success to my students so that they can achieve similar levels of success. In this class, I'll be offering my advice as to what you should do in terms of your preparation for your FAR exam, and also what you should do on exam day to ensure that you maximize your mark. So firstly, in terms of exam preparation, I suggest that you break FAR down by topic and by question type, as this will make your preparation much more manageable, and it will make the whole exam feel much more manageable. So to get an idea of how you might do this, you can look at the course structure for our FAR video course. And the way we break it down is by question type. So in the exam, you'll have an explain the accounting treatment question, a single entity financial statement question, where you have to prepare the financial statements for a single entity, a groups question, and then a mixed topic question, which will include an element of cash flow. And then there'll be some smaller parts to the exam, some smaller requirements around conceptual framework, sustainability, UK GAAP, and ethics. Therefore, we structure our course around these different question types. And I think the best way to start is with the explain the accounting treatment question, because this requires you to really understand the accounting standards for all of the main topics, and therefore it becomes a lot easier when you have to apply them, both in the explain the accounting treatment questions, but also in the later, more computational questions as well. And as I said, it's good to break it down by topics. You can break it down by all the main topic areas. So, assets, revenue, financial instruments, provisions, etc. So breaking it down into smaller, more manageable topics. And then what you need to do for each topic is make sure that you've understood that key technical content and memorize the content that you need to have learned. So if we take assets, for example, it's a good place to start because you've obviously covered this at certificate level accounting, and it's a substantial topic that is examined in almost all FAR exams. So you firstly need to make sure that you've understood that key technical content. So understanding like the basic definition of an asset, resource controlled by the entity as a result of past events, future economic benefits, can be measured reliably. And then I like to think through assets almost like in chronological order. So kind of at day one, what happens, company incurs some expenditure, can they recognize it as an asset, and which costs can be capitalized as part of the asset and which costs have to be expensed to the P&L. And then the next stage is, okay, well, that's recognized as an asset. Then going forward, how is that asset accounted for? Well, it can be measured under the cost model, or it can be measured under the revaluation model. And then make sure you've kind of understood the key differences between the two. And you can think, okay, well, what happens after that? Well, eventually one day the asset may become impaired. So what happens then? Make sure you understand what an impairment is, the principles of measurement, and then go on to the next stage. What then happens? Well, eventually one day the company will want to sell the asset. Maybe they'll make the decision to sell it, and there might be some time before they actually sell it. So can the asset be classified as an asset held for sale? And then, of course, what happens when they actually dispose of it? And then that's kind of the end of the asset, if you like. So we're kind of at the end of the asset's life in the business. So for each aspect, you need to kind of understand the key technical points, why we apply them, as we do, and make sure you kind of understand the accounting, the double entry, which financial statements are affected, etc. So once you've understood the topic, then you need to memorize some of the key content. And you might need to make a decision about what you're actually going to memorize and what you're going to use the open book for. Me personally, I do like to use the open book for some areas of assets, or I would certainly know where the content is. For example, the conditions to classify an asset as held for sale, there's quite a few conditions there. So the open book is quite useful there. Also with intangibles, when you're looking at research and development costs, the criteria for capitalizing as development costs, again, there's a list of strict criteria there. And because there's about 5 or 6 criteria, then similar to assets held for sale, then it's worth just having that tab just so you can jog your memory if you need to. But to be honest, when you practice a few questions, and I've certainly practiced more than a few, you do actually learn those points. But it is useful to have them up there just because there are so many criteria there. But you want to commit as much to your memory as you can, because obviously drawing information from your memory is a lot quicker than drawing it from the open book. And there's a lot of information that, yes, it is in the open book, but it'd be very difficult to find. So you really need to kind of have memorized quite a lot of this content. And a good way to do it would be to, after you've understood the content, see if you can reproduce it on a blank page. This was something I used to like doing a lot for my exams. Can I reproduce it on a blank page? Because then I've learned it. So you can effectively see if you can reproduce this from memory. If you have, then you've understood like the key content, the conceptual framework definition of an asset, and you'll know what cost can be capitalized and what needs to be expensed. So cost not meeting the definition of an asset, costs which are not directly attributable, and making sure you're kind of remembering those key terminology like costs which are directly attributable, future economic benefits, etc. And then, do you know the subsequent measurement, cost model versus revaluation model? What are the key differences? Obviously, namely, as the name suggests, under the revaluation model, revaluing through OCI. And are you remembering as well that there can be that accounting policy choice about transferring the excess depreciation into retained earnings, for example? So you can see, can you reproduce these rules, and therefore have you memorized that key content? Once you have, and of course you can keep going back, if you miss a few points, go back, which ones did you miss? Okay, now try again. Can you redo that and make sure that you've really understood these points as well? It's not just about memorizing, it's very much about understanding as well. So that point comes first, but then there is some, of course, that you need to memorize and commit to your memory. Once you've understood the topic and you've memorized the key points that you need to, and you've decided where you're going to use the open book for the others, then go and practice some questions, and straight away go and practice some exam questions on this topic, on assets, so that you can apply that technical content that you've learned in an exam scenario. And also, that's a different way to actively test yourself. Obviously, the recall of reproducing it is actively testing yourself, but then the best way to really actively test yourself is doing exam questions, because you're going to need to use that information and you'll need to go to apply it to the exam in an exam scenario, in the actual scenario you're going to be examined. These are definitely the best questions to be doing, and in my opinion, the only questions that you need to be doing. So you can then go to past exam, and then you can just go to the assets part of the question. So the explain questions are really good for this because they force you to kind of explain it. So they're really requiring you to kind of have understood the rules and then applying them to the scenario. So it isn't just calculating the numbers. You need to really have understood what the standard is saying and what the framework requires of this specific item, or how to account for this specific item. So you can go to the question, it's, explain the IFRS treatment of the various issues. You usually have to set out the journals as well. It will certainly do in some questions. And then you usually have to calculate revised figures as well. So these are really good questions because they really test you thoroughly on that topic. You have to firstly think about the relevant part of the standard. You then need to apply it to a specific scenario. You then need to calculate the numbers and the impact on the financial statements. You often need to set out the journals as well. So it's really a really comprehensive test of your understanding of this topic. So it's a really great way to test yourself. And I would really certainly definitely start with these questions. And you can just go through and practice, several one after the other. So you don't have to do the whole question. So what we've got in our materials, we've got a list of all of the questions which examine that topic. So you can kind of see here, assets comes up very frequently, very big topic. But you can just go to this part of the question and do that certain issue. So in these questions, yes, they'll examine all different topics, but just go to the one on assets and then go to a different question and then do the other question, that part on assets, and then go to another question and do the part on assets there. So you can just test yourself and do several of these questions one after the other to really kind of test yourself on that topic you've learned. But also, most importantly, you can work on your exam technique as well. You'll start to see the way the examiners, word things, the things you should look out for, such as like prorating, for example, the little things that the examiners include in there, perhaps sometimes to help you, other times perhaps to not so much necessarily catch you out, but really test you to make sure that you have really understood the principles and understood the technical content. So you're testing yourself in the specific scenario you're going to be examined on. You're having to apply it in the exact context that you're going to need to apply it in. You're actively testing yourself on that knowledge you've just learned, and you're working on your exam technique. It's quite a particular exam technique you should use for these questions, and I've made a separate video on this, and I'll explain where you can access that as well, so you can see the exam technique to use, because the exam technique is absolutely crucial in all exams, but it's really crucial with these explain questions because it's quite very possible to get full marks on these questions. So exam question practice, absolutely key, and you can practice it in the ICAEW software as well, so you get familiar with the ICAEW software and get more efficient at that. So after you practice each question, make sure you mark your answer, because then you'll identify which areas you got right, which is obviously great, but areas, and perhaps most importantly, areas where you dropped marks. So if there's areas where you've dropped marks, you can think, oh, I didn't get that right. I didn't know there was a rule that the separate component had to be depreciated separately. Have I missed that? And then you can kind of go back to your notes and think, oh, yeah, that's where that is. I should have picked that up. And you could even go back to the ICAEW workbook, see some examples of it and think, okay, that makes sense. And then, next time that comes up, you'll remember it. So it's really important that you kind of learn from your mistakes. And you should also read the ICAEW examiner comments as well. It's useful to get their insight as to what students do well and what students don't do so well on, and perhaps what they don't do so well on might be perhaps an indicator of what could come up in the future. So then we can just take it one topic at a time and keep doing it like this. So you can go through, practice several asset questions. You don't need to do them all at once. Obviously, there's tons of asset questions here. You could just go away and do kind of like 5, 6, 7, 8. So you've seen the main areas until you feel quite comfortable, and you think, yeah, I'm feeling quite comfortable with assets. I'll save the rest of the questions when I come back and revisit this topic. So now I'll move on to the next topic and just do exactly the same for revenue. Just as we've done with assets, make sure you've understood that key content, memorize the parts that you need to, and then straight away go to recent exam questions in the question bank, and then just practice several questions, one after the other, on revenue. And then again, review your answer, see what you're doing well on, see which bits you're missing, and go back and forth between understanding the content and practicing questions until you feel that you do have a really good grasp on it, and then move on to the next topic. And this will just make it much more manageable because you're just focusing on one topic at a time. There's a huge amount of content to get through, but actually when you do it like this, one step at a time, it makes it so much more manageable. And then just go through them all. So provisions, financial instruments, and you can just use the same study approach, the same study technique on all of the topics, and just one topic at a time, you'll gradually master them all. So of course, what you need to do is have a bit of a study plan to ensure that you cover each topic. We've obviously got all the topics here with the explain questions. Then the single entity questions actually become a bit easier, very much about exam technique, and we go through this in detail a lot in the video course. But once you've actually understood the technical content for all of the main areas, then it's very easy to actually prepare the financial statements. It's just the exam technique you really need to work on in terms of the best way to work through the adjustments. And that's why we focus so heavily on exam technique during our video course. And then with groups, it's kind of similar. You have to go through the technical content first of all to have understood that key technical content. And then it's just a case of going through all of the different question types and having the optimal exam technique for each of those. And then kind of cash flow the same. And then these smaller topics, slightly different because they're generally more narrative and on quite specific topics, but they're relatively easy marks in the exam. So absolutely crucial that they aren't neglected. So of course you need to build this into like a study plan as to, which topics you're going to focus on which days, because obviously you need to make sure that you leave enough time so that you cover all of the topics and that you've got time to come back to some of them, certainly like the main ones, and as well making sure you leave enough time in a few weeks before the exam to do full exam papers. So there's obviously all different ways you could go about setting up your time, but just to kind of give you an idea of something that I did, I would have my kind of weeks leading up until the exam kind of mapped out, and then I would put in all of my essential non-negotiable commitments, obviously things like work. I was working standard UK office hours, and then put in things like lunch, any activities you do. So for me, it was going to the gym a few times a week, and then obviously making sure that you leave enough time in the evening to have some like relaxing and recuperation, making sure you always get a good night's sleep. So once you've put all of that in, you can then see, well, what time do I have available for studying? And then what I would do is just kind of map the topics into each slot. So you can see here, the bigger topics, and you'll know this from how frequently they come up, the exam questions, the amount of content they've got in them. And obviously a quick way for you is just to look at how long the videos are in our video course. But you can see like the big topics like assets, financial instruments, groups, for example. These are big topics. So I'd allocate those to the weekend when I've got more time. So you can allocate like watching a video or, understanding the technical content, reading the ICAEW workbook if you need more detail on it, for example. I'd allocate that to kind of some slots here. And then in the afternoon, the smaller slots, practice some exam questions on it. It's just understand the technical content, then practice questions so you're applying that content. And then with the smaller topics, you can allocate them to the smaller study slots. Like you might look here and think, well, that's not very much time in the morning, or, only half an hour at lunch as well. You might only have half an hour in the morning. But actually, make sure you make the most of those small times and make the most of it when you can grab it, because you could quite easily go through a small topic, like EPS or FX transactions, for example. They're both small topics. Things like ethics or UK gap differences, small topics. You could watch the video, go through the content in the morning, or the morning and at lunch, and then in the evening practice some questions on it. Or even watch the video in the morning, practice some questions at lunch. So you can see by doing it like this, not only does it kind of give you a plan and a structure, which for me I found quite reassuring, because if you're at the start and you're feeling, well, I've got so much to cover, this is overwhelming, actually you've got a plan, and as long as you stick to the plan and make progress every day, the required progress, then you're going to be absolutely fine. So it can be kind of quite reassuring to have that. But not only that, it will enable you to make the most out of all of these small little bits of time that you've got, because if you know what all of the topics are, what the small topics are, you can allocate these small topics to these small little study slots, and time which you might have thought previously, oh, it's not enough time for me to go through a topic or not enough time for me to do a question, actually you can make use of those small little slots. And you can see there as well, practicing a question, if you're just doing like one issue from the explain questions, really doesn't take long at all. And even to do this question, to mark it, read the examiner's comments, would certainly be able to do that within half an hour if you're just doing like one or two issues there. So it really help you maximize and optimize the time that you have. And it will also enable you to have a kind of a clear plan of how you're going to achieve this goal of being fully prepared for the FAR exam. So many people sit this with audit as well. So what can be a really useful thing to do is kind of leverage off your FAR studying into audit, because there is a lot of overlap between the topics. Obviously, from an FAR point of view, it's generally like you're the financial accountant working in-house, preparing the financial statements, and then audit, you're obviously the external auditor auditing those financial statements. But actually the subject content is the same and a lot of overlap between the questions. Like, for example, here we're saying that we need to understand how assets should be accounted for and how to account for them in the financial statements. And that's what we're doing here with this question, and also in the single entity question as well. Then as part of the audit question, you have to identify audit risks and procedures, and questions will usually focus on specific areas, and assets is a very commonly examined area. So once you've gone through the financial reporting treatment for assets, it would make a lot of sense to look at assets from an audit perspective, thinking about audit risks and audit procedures, because if you know how to account for assets, and you know the common mistakes that the accountant makes, then of course you can start to think, well, what would be the audit risks that the assets haven't been accounted for correctly? And therefore this dovetails really nicely with your FAR work. And then you can think, well, what audit procedures would I do to ensure that they have been accounted for correctly? So I would probably, when I do FAR assets, I would then do audit risks and procedures on assets for my AA exam, and then practice some of these questions. Similarly with revenue, after I've been through revenue for FAR, I would then do some audit risks and procedures work on revenue. So therefore you can actually optimize this study plan as well in terms of the different exams that you're doing. And FAR and audit go really well together, and a lot of students sit them together as their first professional level exams. And I think that works really well. And for one of the reasons for that is obviously this overlap between the two in the subject content. And therefore you can be quite smart and leverage off that overlap to really kind of optimize your study time. So you could do FAR assets on the Saturday and then audit assets on the Sunday, for example. And then, like I said, so as you begin your preparation, you can kind of work through every topic, but then as you get closer to the exam, you obviously need to start doing full exam questions, probably about 2 to 4 weeks out from the exam, but start doing full exams under exam conditions. And then after, go through, mark your answer, identify the topics which need improvement, see where you've dropped marks, and then you can go back and just focus on those topics. So for example, if you didn't score very well on the cash flow statement questions, you can kind of go back, revisit this topic, rewatch the video, and then go and practice several questions on that, one after the other, until you get those marks up to the same standard as the other ones. And then do the same process again, do another mock exam, and then see where your weakness areas were there. So that's what I suggest doing in the build up to the exam. Now, on the actual exam day itself, and obviously this kind of applies to your question practice as well. These are some key things to be doing when you're practicing questions, certainly by the time you get doing full mock exams. practicing a full mock exam, and the exam day should feel like the same thing. That's the whole purpose of doing the mock exams and doing them under full exam conditions using the ICAEW software, etc. So make sure you allocate your time so that you attempt every question. And several reasons for this. The main one being is that there are easy and medium marks on every question. You can think of every question as having a mixture of easy marks, medium marks, and hard marks. So there's always enough easy and medium marks to get you up to a really comfortable passing grade, certainly into the 70s. And then there's always some really, really hard marks in every exam, more or less applies to every ACA exam. But all you really need is to get these easy and medium marks. And because they're on every question, the optimal exam strategy to making sure you pass is to attempt every question, get the easy and medium marks on each, don't waste excessive amount of time trying to get the hard marks, and instead focus on getting these easy and medium marks on every question. Also, it's really important to appreciate this headroom marks on the explain questions. You don't actually need to get everything absolutely correct, or you don't need to get everything that's in the ICAEW examiner's answer to get full marks. And it really particularly applies to that question, some of the other narrative questions as well. So actually, you could argue that there's even more easy and medium marks on these questions. In fact, you could probably, in most questions, there's enough easy and medium marks on these explain questions to get you to full marks. Whereas that isn't the case with the other questions, like the single entity financial statement prep questions, the group financial statement questions, and the cash flow. To get 100% on those questions, you need to get all of the marks. There might be a few headroom marks, but there aren't many. Whereas on the explain questions, if we've got a question like this, which I think was worth 27 marks, there's probably about 40, 45 available marks. So there's 40, 45 points you can make, which would each score a mark, but obviously you'd be capped at 27. But what that means is that the effective pass percentage is much lower, because you actually only need to get half of the 27, or sorry, 55% of the 27, to get a passing mark, but there's actually 45 available. Whereas on the other questions, like the single entity financial statement questions, if there's 27 marks, there's usually like maybe 28 points. So if you get a few points wrong, then you're not going to get full marks. Whereas here, if there's 45 points, you only need 27 of those to get full marks. You can miss out a lot of points and still get full marks. So actually, this is a question where it really is realistic for a lot of students to be aiming to get full marks. So it's really important to kind of think strategically about your exam technique and your exam approach so that you can maximize your marks. And attempting every question, and ideally kind of every issue in here, would really increase those chances. Now, there will always be some hard bits. Like here, for example, most of this might be quite easy, but there might be a particularly kind of difficult point here. There might be a particular cost in here, and it's really difficult to know whether it's capitalized or not. It might be something very specific in the standard. That would be a hard point. But I just think, well, I'll just get the rest of the points. I don't know that. I'm not going to waste time looking it up in the open book. I probably won't be able to find it anyway. So therefore, I'll leave that bit out. I'll get, I know that's the hard mark. I'll get the easy and medium points, and then I'll make sure I move on to this point in enough time so that I can get the easy and the medium marks here, rather than spending time chasing this hard point. Instead, I'll be better off moving on and getting the easy and the medium points here. So you have to be a bit smart like that in the exam and look at it in the whole context of how the marks are distributed. And ideally, you'd get onto, every question. Again, maybe something tricky here with an impairment. Maybe sums go into the OCI, sums go into the P&L. Maybe the numbers are a bit quite difficult to work out. But actually, I'm thinking if I've got the relevant part of the standard, I've applied it to the scenario, I've calculated the numbers the best I can, but some of them are a bit tricky. It's time for me to move on. I'm not going to spend an excessive amount of time here because I know there'll be some easy and medium marks here. So that's really a key skill in the exam, kind of appreciating this and appreciating where the easy marks are. So also consider if it's beneficial to attempt several parts of the question simultaneously. This is a great example of this because you need to explain the IFRS treatment for each of the issues. And then for the next part, you need to redraft a profit figure. Well, you're going to need to do both of those things for each issue. Like issue one, you're going to need to explain the IFRS treatment, relevant part of the standard, apply it to the scenario, calculate the numbers, and then the journal entries as well. And then you need to do that for all of these issues. But then for all of these issues, you also need to consider the impact on the profit and on total assets. So actually, rather than going through each issue and explaining it, relevant part of the standard, apply it to the scenario, calculate the numbers and the journals, and then going through all of the different issues, switching your mind between all of the different issues, which in exam questions are on different topics, going from assets to revenue to financial instruments, etc. And then coming to the end and thinking, oh, now I need to calculate the impact on the profits. Well, then you'd have to kind of go back through your workings, maybe even go back through the notes, trying to work out what the exact impact on profit and total assets would be. Instead, it's much easier and much more efficient overall that as you go through and explain the accounting treatment, so relevance to part of the standard, apply it to the scenario, calculate the numbers in a journal, it makes sense to immediately take whatever impact this issue is going to have on profit and assets and put that on straight away. So set these up as draft numbers. And then as you go through and explain the treatment, then when you get to the end of it, think, okay, well, what impact does that have for the second part? Oh, yes, it's going to reduce profit by this and reduce assets by this. And therefore, you've dealt with everything with note one. So then when you move on to what will be a different topic, for example, financial instruments, you can almost like forget about assets for the rest of the question. And that will make your overall approach to the question much more efficient. So there is a video where I demonstrate how to do this, and I'll explain where that is at the end of the class. So as always, I think exam technique is best demonstrated via practical application and demonstration. So there's a question, this question, in fact, that you can see be worked through and demonstrate that exam technique. And then, like I said on the exam, I think go in deciding where you're going to use the open book for, like I said, IAS 38 intangible asset capitalization criteria for development costs, IFRS 5 asset held for sale criteria, because there's very specific criteria there. You might use it for something like borrowing costs as well. That's similar. I think that one's a bit easier to remember, and it's a lot more logical as well. Some people like using it for things like the cash flow pro forma as well. But personally, I think out of the 3 professional level exams where you've got a permitted text, FAR, AA, and TC, I actually think FAR is probably the least useful. It's so big, there's so much detail in there. And also, it isn't that really that useful in the exam. I think most of the content you need to go in knowing. You don't really have time to be looking it up too much. The most useful one is tax, because there's specific figures and allowances. You should quickly look them up, take the number and put it in. It isn't really like that so much with FAR. There's certainly a few bits you might have in there to kind of jog your memory, but I don't think strong students use it much in the exam at all. Feedback we've had is from some of our top prize winning scoring students is that they didn't use it at all. Personally, I didn't use it, and I don't find it that useful in the exam for those reasons. But like I said, there's a few bits in there that you might use it for. And if you do use it a bit more, I'm not necessarily saying that you're not a strong student, but I'm just saying most people, because of the nature of the exam, don't find it that useful. So in terms of other resources that we have available, so like I said, we've got my FAR video course. And this is structured in exactly the same way as I've just explained to you how I suggest you structure your preparation. So it breaks it down by question type and then by topic, and then explains like the key technical content. So I explain it in a nice, straightforward, easy to understand way. And then immediately after, I demonstrate the exam technique that you should be using by working through questions in full. So you can firstly understand that technical content, but the important bit is understanding and seeing how you should be answering exam questions in order to maximize your marks. So I teach you everything from how you should read and interpret the requirement, then on to which parts you should read and in which order, which parts of the question you should answer and in which order, all while applying that key technical content. So if you go to the FAR page on the ACA Masters website, we've got a free sample class available for the course. So you can watch me work through this question that I've been referring to here. And you can see all the key areas like capitalization, revaluation, impairment, all of those key areas are examined. But most importantly, because I'm working through a full exam question, you can see the exam technique that you should be using, particularly things like how to answer several parts of the question simultaneously to optimize your time. So that's a really useful resource that we have available there. But the rest of the course works in the same way. So you will get a real feel for how the course works. Then I just go through the rest of the questions and topics in a similar way. Then, as you've also seen me referring to, we've got our FAR materials, which concisely summarize the key technical content that you need to know. So it makes it much easier to learn the key points that you need to be aware of. So highly summarized version of the technical content. And then, of course, it's also got the master plan sections as well, where it gives you all of the questions which examine that topic. So just as I explained there, you can go through, make sure you've understood the key technical content, and then immediately after, go and practice the questions which examine that topic. And it, of course, covers all of the topics, financial instruments, provisions, groups, etc., as well as all the narrative topics like sustainability, UKGAP, ethics, etc. So really useful for you to be able to just focus on learning that key content and then having the questions to practice afterwards. I also post some useful tips on LinkedIn, so please feel free to add me. It would be nice to connect with you on there. There's also the company page as well, where we post updates. The YouTube channel, the ACA Masters YouTube channel, also has other videos as well on it for all of the ACA or most of the ACA exams, so that's available there. And then the ACA Masters website also has a blog page, and there's an article on FAR. There's also another article which explains about how to make sure that you always pick up the easy marks. So I hope that you have found this session useful. Lots of other resources, as I've just directed you to there, which will help ensure that you pass your FAR exam with a top mark.